On the evening of May 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello walked into the lobby of his apartment building at 115 Central Park West in Manhattan and was shot at close range. He survived. The shooter was arrested, brought to trial, and acquitted when Costello refused to name him from the stand. The shooter was Vincent Gigante. He was 29 years old. What followed that acquittal was a deception that ran for nearly 30 years, and that, by Gigante's own eventual admission in federal court, fooled federal judges, competency hearings, and a generation of clinical psychiatrists. To understand what Vincent Gigante built, and why it held for as long as it did, you have to understand what the Genovese family was. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Genovese family was, by the documented assessment of FBI agents and federal prosecutors who spent careers studying it, the most powerful and most disciplined organized crime family in the United States. It was not the most visible. It was not run by a man who gave interviews, or whose photograph circulated widely in the press, or whose name appeared with any regularity in the public record. It was run by a man almost no one outside federal law enforcement could identify with confidence. A man whose voice had not been captured in any prosecutable context. A man whose identity, by standing order within the family, was never to be spoken by anyone who worked for him. That was how you communicated the name of the boss of what the federal government considered the most powerful organized crime organization in the country. You placed your hand to your chin. You did not say his name. The man who imposed that requirement was Vincent Gigante, and for the better part of 30 years, he conducted that enterprise while federal prosecutors, federal judges, competing mob families, and teams of court-appointed psychiatrists debated whether he was mentally capable of answering for any of it. Vincent Gigante was born on March 29, 1928, in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Lower Manhattan. His parents were immigrants from Campania, in southern Italy. He was one of 5 brothers. The family was not prosperous. The neighborhood was dense, working class, and heavily Italian-American in character. In his youth, Gigante pursued boxing. He competed as a middleweight through the mid-1940s, compiling approximately 25 fights in small venues around New York. He was not a standout fighter. He was, however, composed under pressure. Composed was what he would remain for the rest of his life, regardless of how the public record was made to appear. His entry into the Genovese family came in the late 1940s and early 1950s. According to Selwyn Raab's 5 Families, Gigante rose through the family's ranks as a soldier and eventually a capo, earning the trust of the family's leadership through discretion, reliability, and a demonstrated willingness to carry out assignments that required both. That trust was not built abstractly. It was built through specific acts of demonstrated loyalty to specific men. Chief among them was Vito Genovese himself, the family's namesake boss, whose appetite for consolidating control over the New York underworld had driven a decade of internal maneuvering within the commission's structure. Gigante's alignment with Genovese placed him in the highest tier of family trust, at a time when that trust was the most valuable and most dangerous currency in American organized crime. The attempt on Frank Costello in May 1957 was not random. It was authorized from above. Costello had accumulated power and alliances during the period of Genovese's earlier exile to Italy, alliances that Genovese wanted dismantled. The attempt on Costello's life was a statement of that intention. That Gigante was selected to carry it out was a statement of how fully Vito Genovese trusted him with the most consequential kind of assignment. The failure, Costello surviving, Gigante acquitted, did not damage Gigante's standing within the family. He had carried out the assignment. He had said nothing when arrested. He had held composure through a trial. In the culture of the organization he served, those qualities, reliability, silence, the discipline to say nothing, were the foundational requirements. He had demonstrated all 3, and in the years that followed, as Vito Genovese went to federal prison on narcotics charges in 1959, and the family reorganized under a succession of acting leadership, Philip Lombardo, then Frank Thierry, Gigante continued to accumulate authority within the family's structure. By the early 1980s, according to FBI surveillance records entered into evidence in federal cases throughout the 1990s, Gigante had consolidated effective control of the Genovese family. He was the boss. He had also, somewhere in the years between the Costello shooting and that consolidation of power, begun to build the act. The documented record places the beginning of the performance in the late 1960s. By the early 1970s, FBI surveillance files were already capturing the pattern. In public, Vincent Gigante appeared to be a man in serious mental distress. He walked through his Greenwich Village neighborhood, Sullivan Street, the blocks around the Triangle Social Club, in a bathrobe and slippers. He muttered to himself. His movements were slow and shuffling. He appeared disoriented, detached from his surroundings. According to court documents filed in United States v. Gigante in the Eastern District of New York, Gigante was observed on multiple occasions collapsing in public and was subsequently taken to psychiatric institutions for evaluation and treatment. He was hospitalized. He was assessed by clinical psychiatrists. He received diagnoses consistent with chronic undifferentiated schizophrenia. The hospital records accumulated over years of documented clinical contact. The specific mechanics of the performance were, in retrospect, remarkably disciplined. Gigante did not simply wear a bathrobe and walk around the neighborhood. He built a clinical record. According to federal trial testimony from the 1990s proceedings, he was hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation on multiple documented occasions, beginning in the late 1960s and continuing through the 1970s and 1980s. Each hospitalization produced records. Each evaluation added documentation to a file that, taken in aggregate, presented a consistent clinical picture to any physician or judge who reviewed it. Simultaneously, FBI surveillance operations were capturing a second, entirely different portrait of the same man. In private, in the backyards of family associates' homes in Greenwich Village, and in rooms swept for listening devices, Gigante was composed, alert, and in command. He presided over meetings. He resolved disputes within the family's internal hierarchy. He directed operations. He listened. He gave orders. And when those meetings concluded, he returned to the street, to the bathrobe, to the shuffle. One of the more striking elements of the documented federal record involves the testimony of FBI agents and cooperating witnesses who observed Gigante in both settings across the same periods of time. The man who shuffled past them on Sullivan Street, several later testified, bore no behavioral resemblance to the man who presided in the backyard meetings. Same face, different person. The contrast was not subtle, it was total. His brother, Father Louis Gigante, a Catholic priest who served Greenwich Village and who was himself a recognized public figure in that community, became part of the documented legal record during competency proceedings, testifying to the mental state he observed in his brother. Father Louis Gigante's testimony was entered into the federal record as part of the defense's accumulated clinical presentation. As documented in federal trial testimony from the 1990s cases and in the reporting of organized crime journalist Jerry Capecci, who covered the Genovese family for 3 decades through Gangland News, the no-name rule was absolute and total. Soldiers, capos, and associates of the Genovese family were prohibited from saying Gigante's name in any setting where it might be overheard or recorded. The chin gesture was the identifier. By FBI assessment entered into the federal case record, stricter than anything observed in any comparable criminal organization of the era. The legal logic was not complicated. Federal prosecution requires a defendant who is mentally competent to stand trial. A man who cannot be established as competent cannot be tried. A man who is not tried cannot be convicted. The performance was a legal strategy. And in 1985 and 1986, when the federal government mounted the most significant organized crime prosecution in American history, the strategy demonstrated exactly how effective it could be. The commission case, United States versus Salerno, was the landmark RICO prosecution of the bosses of all 5 New York organized crime families. The government built the case over years of FBI surveillance, cooperating witness testimony, and court-certified documentary evidence. The resulting convictions, handed down in 1986, dismantled the public leadership structure of 4 of the 5 families. Vincent Gigante was named in the case. Vincent Gigante did not stand trial. In 1990, a federal court found him mentally unfit to face the charges. The performance had outlasted the most significant organized crime prosecution of the century. What followed was a decade-long legal confrontation without real precedent. Gigante's defense retained treating psychiatrists who had documented genuine-appearing symptoms of chronic schizophrenia across years of clinical contact. Their position, supported by the accumulated hospital records from hospitalizations that spanned nearly 2 decades, was that Gigante was a seriously mentally ill man who was incapable of assisting in his own defense. The clinical record, by any objective measure, was substantial. The federal government retained its own psychiatric experts, who examined the same individual and reached opposite conclusions. Those experts had access to FBI surveillance documentation, agent observations of Gigante conducting family business with evident clarity and organizational command, that directly contradicted the assessments of the treating psychiatrists. As documented in court records from United States v. Gigante and in Jerry Capecci's reported coverage of the case proceedings, what emerged was a clinical standoff, two sets of qualified expert witnesses, examining the same man, arriving at irreconcilable diagnoses. The government's most effective counter to the defense clinical record was not ultimately psychiatric, it was documentary. FBI agents who had monitored Gigante over years testified to what their surveillance had captured: a man who demonstrated organizational authority, who issued directions that were followed, who resolved internal family disputes through a process that required not only awareness of the dispute itself, but detailed knowledge of the family's hierarchy, its territorial arrangements, its financial distributions, and the standing of every capo involved. That body of testimony, combined with the physical surveillance record of years of monitoring, presented a picture of a defendant whose cognitive function, in private, was inconsistent in every meaningful respect with the clinical presentation his treating physicians had documented. The defense acknowledged the contrast. Its argument was that the symptoms could coexist with periods of functional clarity, that a man could be genuinely mentally ill and still demonstrate apparent capacity in limited and familiar circumstances. The government's argument was that the scope and consistency of the private behavior, documented over a decade and a half of FBI monitoring across multiple administrations, exceeded anything consistent with the diagnosis being offered. The federal judge who ultimately ruled on competency in 1997 sided with the government. The accumulated clinical record, real as it appeared, was outweighed by the documented behavioral record of a man who had run one of the most organizationally complex criminal operations in the country for more than 15 years. In 1997, new indictments were filed, charging Gigante with murder conspiracy and racketeering, charges rooted in his alleged authorization of killings during his tenure as boss and in the documented criminal operations of the Genovese family under his direction. A federal judge ruled him competent to stand trial. Gigante went to trial, he was convicted. In December 1997, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He was 69 years old at sentencing. And then, in plea proceedings entered into the federal record in 2003, Vincent Gigante admitted that he had fabricated his mental illness. He acknowledged, in open court, the clinical record accumulated across nearly 30 years had been sustained deliberately to evade federal prosecution. He received an additional 3-year sentence for obstruction of justice. He had told the truth about lying for the first time in 3 decades. The consequences of Gigante's tenure at the top of the Genovese family are documented across multiple federal cases and in the work of organized crime historians who reconstructed the scope of the family's operations during that period. According to Selwyn Raab's 5 families and federal indictments from the 1990s proceedings, the Genovese family, under Gigante's direction, maintained influence over labor union locals in the New York metropolitan area, extracted proceeds through extortion from businesses operating in its claimed territories, and corrupted the allocation of contracts in construction and sanitation. Union pension funds were diverted. The workers whose retirement security was taken had no recourse against the criminal organization that took it. Among the specific industries documented in the federal record as subject to Genovese family influence during Gigante's tenure was the Fulton Fish Market in Lower Manhattan, for most of the 20th century, the largest wholesale fish market in the United States. According to federal court documents from proceedings in the 1980s and early 1990s, the Genovese family maintained a structured system of control over the market's operations, including the allocation of loading work and access to market stalls, that amounted to an organized extortion operation running across decades. Legitimate fish dealers who wished to operate in the market paid into a system they could not opt out of. The men who ran that system answered to a chain of authority that, federal prosecutors documented, ran to the family's leadership. The construction industry in New York during the same period is documented across multiple federal cases as a source of Genovese family revenue, labor extortion, and the corruption of union officials whose cooperation was either purchased or coerced. The aggregate financial cost to the construction economy of New York during the period of Gigante's leadership is not easily quantified from the federal record alone. What is established is that it was systematic and sustained. What Gigante's specific legal strategy cost the federal system is worth stating plainly as well. A competency defense that successfully removed a sitting organized crime boss from the commission case, occupied years of federal investigative resources, produced multiple rounds of competency hearings over more than a decade, and insulated one of the most consequential mob bosses of the era from accountability for the better part of 30 years. The federal machinery built to prosecute organized crime under the RICO statute of 1970 spent enormous resources on a man who, by his own eventual admission, had been lying to it the entire time. Vincent Gigante spent his final years at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. He had entered federal custody following his 1997 conviction. His health declined steadily in the years that followed. After the 2003 plea proceedings in which he admitted the fabrication, the final legal chapter of his record closed with something that rarely appears in the documented history of organized crime prosecution. The defendant himself confirming, in open court, what the government had spent 3 decades attempting to prove. The 3-year obstruction sentence was not punitive in any meaningful sense at that stage. A man in his mid-70s, in declining health, already serving a 12-year term, it was a legal acknowledgement, a correction to the record. Vincent Gigante died on December 19, 2003. The cause was heart disease. He was 75 years old. He died in federal custody in Missouri. He had spent his entire adult life in organized crime. He had, by the federal government's documented case, led the Genovese family for more than 2 decades. He had, by his own admission, sustained a simulated mental illness across public appearances, clinical evaluations, and federal competency proceedings for nearly 30 years. The family he left behind did not have a single clear successor in the way that earlier generations of the Commission's organized crime structure had operated. The extreme operational secrecy Gigante had built into the Genovese family, the no-name rule, the backyard meetings, the systematic avoidance of any public association between the boss and the family's operations, had produced an organization designed, in some ways, to function without a visible center. It continued to do so. Federal investigations in the years following Gigante's death documented the Genovese family's persistence in diminished form, operating across the same industries and under the same general organizational structure, but without the coherence and authority that Gigante's 30-year tenure had provided. The disciplined invisibility he had built was, in the end, the most durable thing he left behind. The discipline that made the performance possible, the absolute internal control, the chin gesture, the backyard meetings, the careful separation of the public act from the private authority, was also the discipline that made him, during his years of operation, effectively unreachable by the federal machinery that prosecuted and convicted the men around him. Selwyn Raab, in 5 Families, documents Gigante as the most organizationally insulated boss of his era, more successful than any of his contemporaries at avoiding federal accountability, more insistent on operational security, and more consequential in his institutional authority, precisely because he maintained so low and so controlled a public presence for so long. Raab's assessment is that the Genovese family under Gigante represented the peak of organized discipline within the 5-family structure of the post-commission era. Jerry Capecci's 3 decades of documented reporting on the Genovese family detailed the mechanics of the chin gesture and the absolute prohibition on Gigante's name, details later confirmed in the sworn trial testimony of witnesses who worked within the family's structure and who described, under oath, the discipline those protocols required in their day-to-day operations. The historical consensus among organized crime historians and the federal prosecutors who built the cases against Gigante is not ambiguous. The mental illness was a deliberate construction. The evidence for that conclusion is not interpretive or contested in the historical record. It is Vincent Gigante's own words, entered into the federal court record in 2003. It bears stating plainly, Vincent Gigante was a criminal figure who operated within and among Italian-American communities in Greenwich Village and across New York. He represented a small criminal minority within Italian-American history, not a product of that community, and not a reflection of it. The Italian-American community of his era built American cities, served in 2 world wars, and founded industries and institutions across this country. The men of the Genovese family, and the criminal conduct documented in federal cases against them belong to the history of organized crime. They do not belong to the history of an ethnic community. The distinction is documented. It matters. The Vincent Gigante story is, at its core, a story about what sustained concealment costs and what it cannot ultimately prevent. Gigante built the most organizationally insulated operation of his era. He ran it from behind a performance so thorough it required clinical hospitalization to sustain. He outlasted the commission case. He outlasted most of his contemporaries. And then, in the final years of his life, in a federal courthouse in Brooklyn, he told the truth. What the story reveals about organized crime as an institution is what it always reveals. The mechanism holds until it does not. The performance ends. The record stands. Next Tuesday on the Commission Files, we go inside the Castellamarese War, the 14 months of 1930 and 1931 that ended with the creation of the Commission itself and the men who survived it. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The Five Family Files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been The Five Family Files. Good night from the archive.